welcome to Batten Hour on this Monday, September 21st, 2020. I like to say that that's my public service announcement to tell people what day of the week it is these days. I am Ian Solomon, Dean of the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. As many of you know, at the Batten School, we're devoted to developing ethical leaders who have the skills, the knowledge, the values to solve humanity's most pressing public policy challenges. On account of COVID-19 and in the interest of keeping our community safe, we have moved our Batten Hour programming online for the semester. I miss seeing your faces in person, and I'm sure you miss convening with each other for lunch. But a silver lining is that we now get to invite speakers and guests to join our Batten School community who might otherwise be too busy or too far to come to Charlottesville, or who might not fit into the great room here at Garrett Hall. Today, it is a real honor to welcome Anurima Bhargava to join us. Ms. Bhargava is a civil rights lawyer and organizer. She's the vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. She is the founder and president of Anthem of Us, which we will hear about. She was the chief of the Educational Opportunities Section of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. She served as the director of the education practice of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and at the New York City Department of Education. She's a tireless advocate for children, for racial and ethnic minorities, and for our common good. She is also a dear friend and an inspiration from whom I always learn so much. Welcome, Anurima.
Thank you so much, Dean Solomon. It's great to be here with you. And I will never be too busy to come to Charlottesville, so I'm excited about the chance to visit you there once we are out of the time that we are in. I've spent a lot of time there in the past and will absolutely love to return sometime very soon.
Great, well, we will talk about your time in Charlottesville, but first, one of the things I left out of your bio is that you are from the south side of Chicago. Is that where you are joining us from today?
I am absolutely on the south side of Chicago, and I have been here for all of the pandemic. So it's been an extraordinary time to be back at home and in a place which is feeling the impact of this time in extraordinary ways. The neighborhood that I grew up in, the zip code that I grew up in, is the place that COVID has hardest hit in terms of the numbers of cases and the numbers of deaths in Illinois. And it's also a place where we've seen the concerns about systemic racism and multiple forms of oppression come to a head, which is South Shore and certainly lots of other parts of the city have felt it as well. So it's been good to be able to at least feel some of that and to be part of that as we're thinking about what we do in this time.
So I'd love to hear more about what you do in this time, and maybe we could start by having you tell us a little bit about Anthem of Us, what it is, how it got its name, how you stay busy.
Sure. So I came out of the Justice Department in 2016, actually before the election. And one of the things that really struck me was that, one, we weren't really thinking about the kinds of lingering trauma that communities that had been places where discrimination or harassment or violence had occurred, what those lingering impacts were, and what are the ways in which we could actually try and build something different or create a different space for people going forward. And so we used to do that at the Justice Department, because one of the things that was important whenever we looked at an incidence of violence or discrimination was investigating it, holding people accountable where that made sense, and then preventing it from recurring. And one of the things we don't see much of these days is that part about preventing it from recurring. And we spent a lot of time debating what happened, whether someone was 100 feet away or they were 5 feet away, or what was said beforehand, as opposed to the things that lead up to the moment of violence, which are often systems of oppression, things that happen on an everyday basis that all of a sudden come to a head, or we don't think about the things that we need to do to build something different going forward. And so, for example, I was on one of the many members of the Ferguson team at the Justice Department, and I talked to a lot of kids in Ferguson about what happened there. And what they would say to me was, they assassinated my hero. And they weren't talking about Mike Brown. They were talking about the African-American superintendent of schools who had been pushed out by an all-white school board 4 months before Mike Brown was killed. And so when they think about whether or not there are people who are in positions of authority, whether there was systems that felt like they were systems that they could thrive in, that's what they thought about. And I think there's a lot of ways in which those narratives and how do we actually build a sense of potential for something different for our young people, but also for all of us is really important. So that's where Anthem came from. And since essentially for the last couple of years, I've been advising and consulting with foundations, with companies, with schools, with arts organizations, with media organizations about how it is that we can actually center racial equity, racial justice, and also, justice along many different lines in the course of what they do every day. And I work with a lot of mission-driven organizations, which is what I've been a part of, where there's a lot of work we're doing on the outside that are embedded in those kinds of principles, and on the inside, we're often really dysfunctional and don't actually practice those things. And so how do we actually think about aligning values and mission from the inside and out? And obviously, the work has been there and will be there. It's often talked about as diversity, equity, inclusion work. I try to think about it as justice and dignity work. And so it was there for a long time, and I certainly had lots to do. After this summer, it is skyrocketed in terms of everybody wants to be doing something. Sometimes it's performative, sometimes it's a checklist, sometimes it's something actually more meaningful, which is where we want to actually get involved to bring about some lasting change in how we actually address systemic racism and other forms of oppression.
So from a justice and dignity perspective, if you were to do an audit of the United States of America 2020 on justice and dignity, how are we doing?
So I think that the last 6 months have been a economic, social, political x-ray of the United States. We have seen where our bones are broken, where our connective tissue has wiped away, and what it is that we actually need to do to repair that. And in every single sense, there are ways in which the communities that have been hardest hit are the ones that where people are most vulnerable. They have been Black and brown communities. They have been communities where people don't have the kind of financial resources. And so we're sitting in a situation where even during the last 7 months, the rich have gotten richer by the billions, and we have 40 million, or whatever the number might be today. It's hard to say, unemployed and counting. And so I think in so many ways, the idea of what does it mean to have dignity, which is to be able to put in your time, your resources, your hard work, and be able to do at least have the basics, right? Which is to have housing, to be able to feed yourself and your children, to be able to have an education for your kids. And those are the things that we're not actually able to do in the richest country in the world in many ways. And I think that's so we're not providing dignity certainly across the board for so many. And then I think the ways in which we've exposed how we treat each other, how we view each other, and this effort to divide and to proliferate hate instead of actually trying to bring people together is another way in which the very principles of justice and dignity are being threatened, if not broken. And so I think those are, I think what we've seen is it's all kind of, not all, probably we're not even close to all, but a good more than we're used to is being laid bare, and it's pretty ugly what we're seeing.
You've also spent some time in Charlottesville. How did you end up coming down to visit Charlottesville, and what did you learn from your time here?
So I've been to Charlottesville many times. It started actually a friend that I think many of us share was running for Congress in the 5th District, and so I came down to Charlottesville to work on that election back in.
For those of you who
Tom Perriello, who I've known a long time, and so I started to work on Tom's campaigns, and so got to know the district in that way, and then came down actually in September a couple years ago after August 12th, and I came down as part of a team that was both thinking about filming some of the ways in which people were trying to hold white supremacists and others accountable for what had happened in Charlottesville. And I also started to work with some of, to do some exploration with the legal team that was down there. And I found the days I spent there to be a revelation. And we'll say just two things, which is, I think what struck me the most was how we don't, again, in the ways in which we tell stories about what's happening in terms of violence, we don't tell the stories of the ways in which communities have come together to try and fight hate and violence. And so what struck me in Charlottesville was the stories I heard from students, from longtime Charlottesville residents, from those who worked as dishwashers in the UVA system, to church and religious leaders, that they had actually really come together to train in nonviolence, and to knowing that there was going to be some of the violence coming, how they would actually stand together and learn about each other. And I think that's one of the most extraordinary things that I heard about that lasted, which is these relationships that came in a moment of fear and hate and violence, and in many ways, built a community around that. And then the second thing that I really learned from Charlottesville, and one of the things that I spent some time on was like, what are the ways in which, as compared to Ferguson and lots of other places, was there efforts to try and make sure children who experience the trauma, how are they processing it? And I think there was some really, really good work being done from a mental health and schools and medical perspective on that in Charlottesville. In the midst of that, I talked to one of the longtime residents of Charlottesville since she was born, a 63-year-old African-American woman whose son was right in the middle of the violence. And she had been one of those people who had trained in nonviolence with many others in her community. And she said to me, she's like, look, I didn't really think that much about race for most of my life. I know that sounds strange being an African-American woman in Virginia, but it just wasn't something that I spent a lot of time, focused on. And she's like, but that changed in the last year. And she's like, now, though I'm kind of off footing, I don't know exactly where I stand. And when we asked her about that, she said, the hardest thing for me is that I don't know if I'm looking at a white person, if I'm looking at someone who wants to kill me, or if I'm looking at someone who, like on that day, said to me, I know that you are in more danger than I am, and I'm going to stand in front of you and ultimately give my life for you. And she's like, I don't know which one of those people I'm looking at. And I keep thinking about that as we try to figure out how do we build bridges and make some repairs in America at this moment, which is how can we look at someone and know if it's fear or if it's love or if it's community that we're able to bridge with that person. And so I think it's one of the things that we all need to think about, how do we actually change and go back to the work that I've long done, which is on segregation in schools. How do we actually teach our children something different about how we can look at each other, not just in that one moment, but from the very early days of when we're learning, who we can trust and who's part of our community and who we can have faith
in. And from your work with children and students and your time here, what do you see that works best? Are there best practices you've seen in classrooms or in legislation and policy that help us move more towards love than towards fear?
So there's a long-standing debate, and certainly Virginia has been a part of it for much of its history, which is, how do we think about what our public schools, what our schools more generally, whatever form they may take at this moment, what they mean and what their role is in our community and in America as a whole. And I would say that this time is really, I think, reminded me as someone who worked on things like school segregation for a long time, what happens, what the result is when we live in communities and we go to schools, particularly for our kids, where you're not encountering people who are different than you are. And also, so the first thing I would say is, while it's certainly not the answer in its entirety, it is really important that we think about ways in which we can bring children together in schools, and we can bring them together across many different lines. I think it's really important that we think about and allow for, when we continue to have challenges on this front, allow for our universities and our learning environments to be places where we are supporting a diverse range of peoples and a diverse range of views, right? And there that's not easy, right? It's not an easy thing for any of us to be able to do, but certainly the effort to sort of shut that down, or to suggest that the ways in which we should interact with each other is to segregate and divide. That's not going to work for changing the trajectory and the journey of America. And what we saw was that we saw schools begin to actually become more integrated in the 1970s and 1980s, and then basically we stopped worrying or working on those issues. And so we haven't had a new case around school desegregation in many years, even though we have cases that have been lingering for 50 years, 40 years, 30 years. We haven't had new cases. And so schools have rapidly resegregated. And so part of what we're seeing is the impact of that. We see that in Sanford, Florida, where George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin both went to school. It was a school district that desegregated and then rapidly resegregated. And I think if there was a situation in which they both, and I'm not suggesting this might have changed what is, the craziness of George Zimmerman and the horrible, brutal ways in which he has continued to live his life. I would say, however, that if he had been exposed to people who were different than him, and the same for Trayvon, who was also in a school where he didn't have those kinds of opportunities in the way that I think he and his parents wanted, that maybe that trajectory would be different. But that's not what we're doing in our schools, which are as segregated now as they were in 1970.
Are there promising efforts, either political or judicial, towards renewing the ideal or the dream or the legal basis for integration?
So it's an interesting question. So I worked on some cases back in 2006, 2007 that were about communities wanting to, on their own, voluntarily wanting to actually make sure their kids could go to school together in diverse spaces, and then that was challenged, right? And so then and that went all the way up to the Supreme Court in cases called Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District. And in Parents Involved, it limited the ability of communities, even voluntarily, to be able to engage in some of this work. And I think so there's the question of, like, how do we actually create some space within the school's context to try and do some of this work. There's also just the questions of how do we actually address the barriers that continue to be there that we've seen, when I talked about what's been laid bare in the last 6 months, these barriers to where it is that we live, who has access to housing, who has access to schools, what are the ways in which we've essentially continued to redline is a word that we use in the economic context, but we certainly continue to redline neighborhoods around America. And we see, even in the rhetoric coming from the president of, hey, suburban folks, like, I'm going to keep all the low-income people out of your neighborhoods, and that's this big promise I'm going to make for you. The idea that somehow or another people who may be different from you in terms of class or race are to be feared and to be kept out is a cultural change that I think we need to address. And then there's, again, back to, we had a limited number of, we were limiting the number of tools. I think there's ways in which we need to be more creative about not looking to the legal system, but to look to a range of levers to try and figure out how we dismantle the segregation and divides that we see.
Great, thank you. Let me invite everyone who wants to ask a question to please use the Q&A function. I have many more questions that I will ask Anurima, but as you enter your questions, I'll try to weave them into the conversation as well, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. Maybe Anurima, you can talk about, how did you end up on the United States Commission on Religious Freedom?
It's a really good question, because I don't know.
Chair, no less.
Yeah, so I don't know all that much about religion, and I certainly didn't know that much about religion around the world, and it's been an extraordinary learning process for me. I got a call from Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office and others about wanting someone to serve on the Commission on International Religious Freedom. My religious background is that I'm Hindu, and there had been a Hindu chair, actually, of the commission, Preet Bansal, previous to me, and I think they wanted to bring someone on who was, there were a number of Christians and evangelicals and others on the commission. They wanted to bring in a range of people from different religious and other backgrounds. I also think it was helpful to have someone who could bring a human rights, civil rights lens to the work of religious freedom. There's a way in which religious freedom has been cast as something that is for Christians, for white people, for more in line with what the Republican Party cares about. I mean, there's lots of different stereotypes about what religious freedom is actually about, and I think what we've seen around the world is the way in which religion has particularly in the last 5 to 10 years become the focal point, whether it be the actual focal point or a way in which to actually divide. It's become the focal point of extraordinary violence in parts of the world. And so I was really interested in thinking about places like Burma and Bangladesh and the Rohingya, like what's happening in China with the Uyghurs, like what's happening in India, where there is extraordinary, there's a rising intolerance on the religious end and violence that has been associated with that, including through legislation that's being passed. And so there were many parts of the world that I wanted to be able to spend some time and understand the complexities of the ways in which religious freedom broad scale was playing out that didn't really fit this traditional narrative of it just being something that Christians or evangelicals cared about. And so that's where I joined.
So there's a question from Jackie about how do you suggest we bring people together who disagree? And my understanding is the makeup of the commission has you working side by side with people with very different political views than you. What have you learned about trying to collaborate and work in constructive ways with people with whom you disagree?
Sure. So I joined a commission that included commissioners who have spent most of their life trying to destroy pretty much everything I spent my civil rights life trying to build. And so that means that when we think about those who have opposed LGBTQ rights, who have come out with really difficult positions on everything from sexual violence to race, to how we think about who can be part of our communities. These are folks who are serving on the commission with me. And so I started by thinking that something I had learned, I'm part of this Presidential Leadership Scholar program where I'm like with 60 other people who, half of whom share different views than I did. And I learned that oftentimes if you start you're gonna have values that you have in common, you have stories that are in common. And so I started there. And so one of my fellow commissioners, who's also now a vice chair of the commission with me, is Tony Perkins, who's the head of the Family Research Council. And Tony and I, there were a number of people who we talked about and things that we might agree on that we were surprised by domestically. And so what happened over the course of the last year and a half, and this is not with all the commissioners, and I'll tell one story about one that this has not been the case with, but with a number of the commissioners, what we found is that when we're engaged in this work, there's a lot of learning that we all have to do. Like there's a lot they don't know and there's a lot that I don't know, and part of it is learning together. And when you're actually in that process together, it's harder to come to very different views when you're hearing and seeing the same kinds of things. And that's one of the things that I try to engage in with some of my fellow commissioners domestically. It's not what we do as a commission is to focus on what's happening in the U.S. At all. But one of the things when we sat down and actually had dinner or had conversations was on things that are really divisive topics in America, like immigration and family separation. I couldn't understand how people had different views on what it meant to separate families, many of whom were religious, were families who came from the same religion or same faith as some of the people I was talking to. And what I realized is that there's very different information that's being shared. There's very different understandings. And so part of what we've been trying to do is let's see if we go to the same places together and we see the same things. We literally have made trips, right? Maybe we could actually come to some common ground. And so that's been the way in which I haven't focused on, and I don't actually listen to podcasts or other things that come out of some of my fellow commissioners' organizations, because I think it would literally, I wouldn't be able to deal with it, right? What I've tried to focus on is the things that we can actually, what are the spaces of learning where there's not understanding, and opening up that space in a way that's not as judgmental on either end. And I think that's really helped in creating something where we can actually work together and back to dignity. I think we have a lot of respect for one another's opinions and dignity in that. And so I mentioned that there was one person who didn't want, and others who might not have not fallen into this space where I feel like there's constructive work that can be done. And one of those people, I'll just give the story of when we first met. I walked into an event, and it was my first official day as a commissioner in a public space, and met one of my fellow commissioners, and the reaction was, I think I'm just going to call you commissioner because I don't think I can pronounce your name. And so I leaned over and whispered into his ear. I was like, so this is how this is going to go. I'm going to whisper my name into your ear over and over again until you say it out loud and you say it properly. And then the next day we were in the Senate in the Kennedy room, caucus room, and we were having a hearing. And I sat deliberately between him and another one of the commissioners who, at that point, I didn't think I would share as much as I do in terms of values and otherwise. And I sat there and I wrote my name phonetically on a piece of paper. And I said, if you get bored during this hearing, you can keep practicing my name. And so there's a way in which, like, it's also important to start as you mean to go on, and to approach these spaces where people and call them out on the kinds of ways in which people are trying to either diminish you or not hold you in your full value. And I recognize how hard that is, right? It's really hard. It was really hard for me as a young woman of color to do that in a lot of spaces. It's really hard to do that when you feel like you're coming into a place where others have power. And so I'm not saying it's difficult. It's an easy thing to do, but I think it's one of the main ways in which I could at least try and maintain my dignity and value with some of those on the commission. And even though the onslaught in different ways continues from that same commissioner, at least I feel like I haven't cowered in or bent in the wake of it.
And one of the ways that the commission has an impact, either domestically or internationally, can you talk about are the things that you're proud of that the commission has done together by being able to bridge differences internally to make a difference either on US policy or international policy?
So there are, and I'll mention a few areas of the world. One of the places that we are all deeply concerned about is what's happening in Syria, and in northeast Syria, there's an area where for some time we found it to be a place where a lot of communities, many of whom had been displaced, were actually able to live together in relative peace, right? And that was something that we didn't see in other parts of the region. Last year, when we made some missteps, to put it very, very mildly, in terms of the ways in which we were supporting that region, and also the protection of those who had fought and worked alongside the United States to create a bulwark against some of the real violent forces, both within Syria and Turkey and other parts of that region. When that happened, I think part of the commission was able to come together and really talk about how important it was that there was an area that is protected and that we fight for, that people across different religious faiths can live and participate and be able to survive in. And so that's one of the places where we've seen a collaboration and a collective action by commissioners across the board on an area like Northeast Syria. Another is and this is just a positive, I think in many ways a positive, I hope to continue to be positive situation, which is that in Sudan, which is a place that I actually had a chance to visit this February, we met with the new prime minister of Sudan, who came out of a joint civilian military government, and that government was set up after 30 years of Islamist rule. And so Sudan is another place where I think really lifting up the country and what's happening there in terms of they've repealed public order laws that would, that someone would be flogged. Women would be flogged for for not wearing a hijab, for their guardianship laws. There's ways in which people were punished for all kinds of things in terms of apostasy or blasphemy or anything that was spoken that wasn't in line with the government's view. In places like that where we've been able to support the opening up of a community to all, and in a place that has been subject to so much violence, I think that's been another positive that we've actually been able to come together on as well. So there are lots of examples. I traveled around the world with commissioners who were appointed by President Trump, and we were able to go to places like Burma and push, and to the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh and push, and that that is something really remarkable, to be able to speak in one voice and make recommendations, which is what we do to the president, to the State Department, and to Congress. And to know that right now, I have no interest in going into the White House, and it's important to have people who do and who have really close relationships and can speak on issues, including refugee caps. It was important. We spoke as one voice to the administration and saying, you can't zero out the number of refugees coming to this country. We're working around the world to talk about the violence that they're experiencing, and how can you say that we're gonna zero that out and make it a really minuscule number. And that's, those are important places where we've been able to talk together, and we have an avenue in with the fact that there are, a number of commissioners who are close to this administration.
Oh, that's tremendous. So given your experience on the margins of either politics, race, religious differences, there's a question here from Deborah Mosby about how do you feel about the design and implementation of a formal conflict or diversity awareness curriculum for classrooms, either elementary classes, where I know you spent some time, or college or graduate school classrooms?
I think it would be extraordinarily helpful. I think let's just go to the really basic moment, right? Which is, we know that those who are bullied in their earliest years, even in classrooms, are often those who have been bullied. The simple mantra of hurt people. And so if we don't have other ways in which we actually find we're able to give our young people, but also give, frankly, adults tools and resources. It's the thing that I get asked most often is, I have a lot of anxiety. I mean, we've talked about it as, in the common conversations over the summer, white fragility, other things, but fragility, anxiety, fear around how to actually engage with people across difference. And so if we can give people a greater sense of a greater sense of what the tools and the resources and the kinds of spaces and the ways in which people could actually engage, I think it would be tremendously helpful. I will say, in schools, one of the things that has been positive over the last, 20, 25 years is that, we had in the 80s this proliferation of zero tolerance for any kind of misconduct that was happening in schools. And then we started to really think about other ways in which to address any kind of misconduct that was happening. And I am a huge fan in many different contexts for restorative justice, for creating spaces that are, whether it be in circle, whether it be a space in which people can actually talk through and figure out other ways in which to mediate conflict, tensions, violence that's happened. It's not for every instance. I'm certainly not advocating it across the board when there's other things that might be needed, but it is, we've seen positive behavioral interventions and supports, which is something that's it means something. It started out in the disability community in the context of schools, but it's something that is actually really extended to how we look at things like school climate and promoting a positive school climate is what are the ways in which we support and cultivate different behavior instead of punishing the existing behavior. Those are all things that I think would be really helpful in classrooms and otherwise. I will say this is a personal view. I think it's hard to teach diversity and not have places to practice it, right? So I think creating spaces where we're around, and it can be across any different line, whether it be sports, whether it be, it be like some arts engagement, some way in which you're finding, something common, whether it be teaching, whatever it is, right? But to find spaces in which we can actually be in some kind of community with one another, I think is actually really important for for the long-term work of embedding, the feeling of support, safety, comfort, welcoming, inclusion, belonging. Like lots of those goals and efforts are ones that happen when we actually have some spaces to work in and do the work in.
So the question now is, how optimistic are you? And the question comes in from Catherine Johnson about in the light of the recent death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. How optimistic are you about progress on social justice, on learning, on bringing people together as you talk about? And what do you think are the best channels to which to make social change and advance these goals that you talked about?
Yeah, so it's been a tough number of months, I think, for everyone. I think it's been a tough couple of months, certainly being in America and seeing the repeated and ongoing way in which we see violence towards Black and brown communities and Black communities in particular. And so, and it's been difficult to see the ways in which we seem to be going backwards, at least if we look to the leadership of the current administration on issues around the rights and benefits that I think women need to be able to thrive in the workplace, things that Justice Ginsburg fought her entire life for. And so in that way, I think it's really difficult. Like there's a question of like the emotional bandwidth of any of us to sort of fight out of the hole, and then even to sort of try to be able to reimagine or imagine differently what we could have going forward. And so I'd say a couple of things, which is the place that I learned that I wasn't in, for much of my professional life. I spent at national organizations. I spent in the Justice Department or in the US government. And so I didn't really spend that much time on the local level. And one of the things that I will say is that I think we're missing it in terms of the ways in which a lot of the really hard work gets done, and it gets done in extraordinary ways in communities and in neighborhoods and in cities. And so I think that the part that I look at with optimism is I think it's extraordinary that we've had people come out into the streets, into their community, and gather as communities over the last 6 months in ways that, as we've seen, it might not be the media narrative, it certainly might not be the administration narrative, that 95% plus times have been in very peaceful, community-oriented ways. And I think it's important for us to look to that, which is, that in the midst of I'll say at the beginning of March, I was entirely afraid of what was going to happen on the south side of Chicago. And I was worried about, like, literally there's going to be violence in the streets. There's going to be, that it would be, that in a situation in which, there's 80% youth unemployment in the area, like what was going to happen? And I look to there's certainly not enough investment going into my neighborhood or neighborhoods around me, but what I do see is the ways in which communities have been able to try and help each other out and find ways to survive. And we see that over and over again. So that's where the optimism lies. For me, it doesn't lie in seeing what's happening, certainly on a national level and even on a global level, where we're seeing, frankly, nationalism and a bunch of regimes that are grounded in fear and in hate as a way to keep their power. We see that all over the place, and I think that's not where I get my optimism from. I forget the rest of your question, Ian, so I'll just stop there. And
the most effective ways to organize around the social justice issues that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is associated with, but also, and Victoria Nelson's a follow-up question specifically around Roe v. Wade, and what does it look like to protect Roe v. Wade in an unbalanced Supreme Court, she writes.
So, I think there's a lot of conversations about what the road forward is for the Supreme Court. Let me just start by saying this, which is, obviously, we already have, and in Virginia, the election is already underway, and we've already seen efforts to try and intimidate people who are trying to get to to vote, even in the midst of a pandemic. And so I think the first place to start always is I'm not saying that the electoral process is the only way to engage. It's certainly one among many, but I do think it's an extraordinarily critical one at the federal, the state, and the local level right now, which is to send a message about what this country and what our values are really about. And so what we're seeing is consolidation of power and consolidation of resources that are then sort of fueled back into the system, and in a way in which the few are really trying to hold on to power. If there was voter suppression, efforts to try and keep people from being able to exercise their right to vote, whether it be in Florida with those who actually by popular vote got the ability when they're returning from being incarcerated to be able to vote. That was something that went to a popular vote and they got that right back. And then it was another level of efforts now to keep 750,000 people from the 1.4 million who were able to get that right to vote essentially restored, from them voting again. And all of these efforts are ways in which we see the fear of what it means to actually have the values and the voice and the perspectives and experiences of most of America really heard and implemented. And I think in some ways, when I think about what we're dealing with in this election, it kills me that there is $500 billion that went to a bunch of corporations over the summer, because I think in so many ways it's just like the fueling of the ways in which money is playing out in politics. I'm tired of getting, like I'm sure you are, I'm tired of getting texts every day asking me for money, because I want this election to not be about that and be about those voices that are coming forward. But we've seen what's happened when we have an electoral system that's kind of based in the way that based both in money and in consolidation of power in the way that it has been over the last 15, 20 years. So back to the organizing piece. I think first, obviously, getting a chance to vote, getting other people to vote. I spend 2 or 3 hours every day now. I was phone banking, text banking, doing anything I can do. I was on the DNC platform committee, and it's not something that I was used to. I'm not usually in party politics, but I've been trying to find ways in which we can try and move some of this work forward in whatever way. And I harass all the people in my universes constantly, which is here's the ways in which you can get involved this week, and put out an election guide and action plan in the last couple of weeks for friends and family to be able to use. So I think those are the beginning parts. The second is in terms of organizing is to realize that even in this moment, right? We talk a lot about what it means to be proximate, as Brian Stevenson has long tried to encourage us to be. We are as proximate to the person who, in this moment where we're on Zoom and we're on screens, we're as proximate to someone who might be around on the other side of the world as we are to the person who's down the street. And I think trying to find ways in which we organize that make people feel less lonely and make people feel like they're, so going out of the ways in which we have now geared our organizing, which is social media and the like, finding other ways in which we can actually try and build community. I was really heartened yesterday to see a photo of a bunch of friends who, like, their entire block was people sitting outside on chairs writing postcards together, right? And it was like a couple blocks of that, but just feeling that sense is so important right now. And so it's not a organizing tactic other than to say that finding other ways in which you can actually build a sense of community, I think right now is the main way in which I think about organizing. And then to really, we've part of the reason we are where we are on the federal level is because of what's happened on the local and state level. And so I think there's like a sense for all of us that we want to be out here doing like glory work. And the part of what drove me insane in this time has been people calling me and asking me how they can volunteer for the election. And I'm like, you have multiple Ivy League degrees, like figure it out, right? Like it can't be this hard. And part of what they're asking, which is implicit in the asking, is what's the most important thing I can do? What's the like perfect thing I can possibly do? And which the race that like my $3 is going to make a huge difference in? And part of it is like, let's just stop for a moment. I don't care like where, at some point, just do something, right? Is what I keep saying to folks is like, just do something. And stop all the kvetching about what it is that you actually think you need to be doing, and just get out there. And if it means you're giving $10 and you give $10 to 10 races, fine, I don't care. Like just do something. And so I don't mean to be like that's been my main message about organizing, is just like it. And I find women are out here, I'm just going to make it with my reflection of the weekend, is that women are out here doing something. And a lot of this is my little sphere that I'm in, a lot of the men I'm around are like asking me those questions, and I'm like, just go do something. And so that's where I'll suggest that everyone spend some time organizing. Is it can be, for me, it can be like, go plant something in a community garden to being part of this election. But right now, if you're asking me about organizing, I certainly am probably very, very obsessively focused on the election for a lot of reasons.
No, makes good sense, and I love the advice to do something. Kat Rogers has asked, do you have any recommendations on books, podcasts, films, etc., to help students delve further into some of these issues as a young person, as a student, as a future policymaker? Sure.
So one of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing that Dean Solomon didn't have a chance to mention is that I produce documentary films and do a lot of work on documentaries. So I'm gonna start with that, which is I think there's a number of documentaries and a lot of people are watching because they're at home watching videos and other things right now. So a couple of documentaries, films that I would recommend. The Sentence, which came out on HBO, I think a year and a half ago, which was really it had a lot of impact on even members of Congress in terms of the passage of the First Step Act, which is at best a first step, but an important one. And then so The Sentence is one. I think on really understanding some of our histories. I'm Not Your Negro, which is a documentary on James Baldwin. I would certainly commend to folks to watch. I think so. This is a book/film, and it's not a documentary. I think watching any version of Just Mercy or reading the book should be like necessary parts of what we engage in America right now. Isabel Wilkerson just came out with a book in the last couple of weeks called Caste, which I think is it's absolutely extraordinary to really think about caste in America and the ways in which the systems of oppression mimic some of what we've seen in Germany and India and other parts of the world over time. In terms of what's happening globally, actually, let me just put one other thing out here. I think part of what we have to understand is mental health and trauma and the ways in which that plays into what we're all handling and dealing with in the world. And I don't think we have a good understanding of that and the ways in which we come to spaces and trauma and mental health play such a role in that. So, I think about like The Body Keeps the Score, which is a book about the brain and the mind and trauma. I think about some of the books that have come out that have really focused on mental health issues. The former Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy, came out with a book called Together about the importance of mental health and thinking about our general health. And so those are some thoughts on that. I can give you a very long list, and maybe we can do this in some form of documentaries. There are a lot that are coming into mind, on the disability community, Crip Camp, on ways in which our economy is linked and being impacted in multiple different ways. American Factory, So, and now I'm just blanking on the 800 other ones I would reach. There's a series actually that came out of Chicago, Oak Park. high schools called America to Me that is about schools issues and really gives you an inside glimpse. It's a 10-part series. And then just because, I have the chance, one of the documentary series that I have been a consulting producer and legal advisor on is airing on HBO right now, in the Game of Thrones slot on Sunday nights. It's called The Vow. Gene Solomon knows some of the other people involved in it as well, but it's about a self-improvement group named by the media as a sex cult called Nexium in upstate New York. And the reason I'll put it out there as one of the things to think about is because it talks about people's search for belonging, and wanting to improve themselves in these times, and how that can take a very different and dark turn in many ways. The other thing I would say is that there's a number of different really good documentaries on what's happening in terms of disinformation and social media. So I would, The Great Hack, which is about Facebook and manipulations on Facebook, which I also worked on in some ways, and then Coded Bias, I don't think is out yet, but it's about artificial intelligence and the ways in which and talks about the work of Joy Buolamwini, who's at MIT, who's looked at the ways in which racial bias plays out in a lot of technologies, and they have this extraordinary algorithmic justice league, which makes me extraordinarily happy just to be able to say that's in that film and documentary. So, and then the last thing is Surviving R. Kelly, which is a docuseries that came out. I just think is important to think about the ways in which we see violence, obviously by, in that case, one particular high-profile perpetrator, but the ways in which Black and brown girls, I think, are experiencing sexual violence in so many ways. And those are stories that we just really haven't told in the way that they need to be. I could go on about that.
No, that's a tremendous gift of lots of recommendations. So we're down to our last few minutes. I'm going to summarize some of the key lessons that I took away and then turn it back to you for kind of some conclusions, or tell me what I missed or got wrong. One, I'm really moved by just the urge we need to kind of return to the urgency of desegregation. Desegregating our schools, our friend groups, our online communities, our news sources. Can we renew the call to integrate towards a more perfect union? The second is, I love your line, hurt people, but I also like to believe that healed people can heal people. And I think the work you do has been a lot about healing and healing kids, kids in communities that have actually suffered trauma. They can find healing so they can actually be, forces for good and forces for growth and healing in their communities. You make me feel less lonely. And I think the call to be proximate, the call to restore that sense of belonging, I think is so critical, but not only during the COVID days, but all the times in our lives, especially for people who kind of are often need some help to feel more connected. And then do something. Don't keep asking, how do I get to the most important job, or how do I get on the right Biden committee or whatever it may be. No, make a difference. Serve in some way, make other people's lives better. Don't sit around and pontificate about how you can be more influential. Start having an influence, including learning. And you gave us a whole bunch of great suggestions from The Great Hack and Coded Bias, The Sentence, Cast by Wilkerson, and how we can maintain that sense of curiosity about things, that we can keep an open mind, keep a beginner's mind, and keep learning. If people wanted to learn more about Anthem of Us or learn more about you, where could they go, Anurima?
They can go to anthemofus.com, but I will tell you that one of the things that has failed in this pandemic is updating it or actually having any kind of good social media presence. So it's in the world of doing something, I've sort of not really spent any time on branding it or putting it together. So we'll work on that. It's on the list, and it might not happen before this election, but that's one place. And certainly the commission's website, and then also I think I'm happy to have folks join on various social media spaces where I'm getting more and more active to try and get messages and other things out. And so I'm happy if people want to join in those too, and just give me a heads up that this is the reason why.
Any concluding thoughts before we wrap the afternoon?
Let's go to work. We got a lot of work to do. Yeah, but let's go to work.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me and for joining the Batten community. We hope we have you back in person, back down to Charlottesville with all of us before too long. In the meantime, glad you're out there fighting the important fight and making this country stronger and making this world more just, more humane, more compassionate, more integrated. Appreciate you and your work.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you're there. I'm glad Jim Leffler, who's in the chat, is there. You have an extraordinary group of people at the university and in Charlottesville, and that also gives me a lot of optimism about what you can all build together. So, thanks.
Well, thank you, and I'll thank also Ranjana, your mom, who I think is listening, and Vijay, hopefully, your dad, and hope to see them as well soon.
Yes.
Take care, everybody.